This beautiful metal beast is called M60 Patton Tank, and this is actually one of the most widely used American tanks in history. And in today's two-part video, we're going to be talking about this tank, what it's all about, and also are going to talk about one mission where this tank played a very important role and has served the United States very well. Hopefully you enjoyed this video, and welcome to What the Math. So this M60 Patton tank is actually a tank that was originally introduced in December of 1960 to the United States Army and has developed from the previous model of M48 Patton. And over its lifetime, this tank has undergone quite a lot of upgrades and updates and was actually in service until as late as 2005. As a matter of fact, the last tank to be retired from the US Army was in 2005. So this tank was in the United States Army for something like 45 years. But despite being retired in the US, it's still used widely in some of the other countries, and specifically in Israel, Turkey, and Egypt, where something like 2,000 tanks are actually still in active use today. Now this tank was actually developed because during the Hungarian Revolution, when the Soviet T-54 tank was captured by the British forces, they realized that their previous tanks, specifically M48 tanks that were used in the US, were not really well built to withstand some of the T-54 attacks, and specifically the new 155mm from the T-54 tank would actually destroy it quite easily. And so the new program has been launched to try to create a new and upgraded tank that could actually not only withstand an attack from a T-54 tank, but would obviously be able to defeat it as well. And this is how this awesome beast was born. This M60 A1, A1 stands for the version of the tank, was actually created and built in the 60s and had an improved armor, improved gun, and of course improved engine as well. And although it kind of resembled the M48 tank, it actually was superior in every single way. And I think the main similarity between this tank and M48 was of course the fact that its escape hatch was actually under the hull. All the future models had escape hatches in other locations, but this was the last time that the escape hatch for a tank was actually underneath. Now, in terms of the actual versions, there were three main reiterations of this tank. There was the M60 A1, which you're seeing on the screen right now. There was also the M60 A2, which is right here. And this is actually a really interesting design. It's called Starship because the technology that they used in this second model was supposedly borrowed from the space age. During the space raid between the US and the Soviet Union, a lot of the technology has been borrowed and put into this tank. But the irony here was that despite its fancy technology, this was actually a very underwhelming tank. It was actually below average in everything. As a matter of fact, it was so bad that it has never even seen service. But its main difference for this particular model was that it could launch an MGM-51 Shilelage anti-tank missile. In other words, its turret could actually launch missiles that would be an anti-tank guided missiles that could then actually, destroy tanks. And I'm gonna try to demonstrate this in the game right here. But due to the fact that everything else about this tank was so underwhelming, and because it was so hard to use, and because it had slow reload speed, it had a lot of it had a very high profile, and it was very easy to hit by other tanks. It really never became really popular, and as a matter of fact, it just was a prototype, and the US was very unsuccessful in trying to sell it to other countries as well. But the original model called M60 A1 was very successful. As a matter of fact, this model was used in quite a lot of different conflicts and was the main battle tank used during the Vietnam War. And so despite the US losing that war, this was actually the tank that did most of the work and participated in quite a lot of different action against the Vietnamese T-55 and T-54 tanks. But then there was actually another model, and here specifically we're talking about model M60 A3, which unfortunately I haven't unlocked in the game yet, but it was very similar to M60 A1. And basically, after the failure of the Starship model, the US decided to go back to the original creation, and they recreated a similar but very advanced model called M60 A3. And here, this model had a very similar chassis and very similar design, but obviously everything else, including armor and optics, and of course the engine, as well as the thermal imaging and the main gun, were all improved. They were made much better than on the M60 A1 model. And interestingly, this model even included a telephone on the outside that the troops from the outside could actually use to call the commander and to basically guide them and or tell them what they needed. So the radios actually were not used as much, but you could just basically call up the troops on the inside of the tank by picking up the phone that was located on the outside. And on top of that, this particular model also had instrumentation that was used to direct artillery from the outside. So this was one of the few tanks that could actually direct artillery and tell the artillery turrets where to fire by using the advanced artillery direction system that was available for this tank. And this particular model has actually seen quite a lot of service as well, but it did participate in some of the major battles during the Gulf War, where along with the M1 Abrams tank, this was actually a tank used by quite a lot of different American forces. And one battle specifically that we're going to be discussing in the next video is actually that battle from that particular conflict, where something like 200 M60 A3 tanks tried to attack an Iraqi airport that was protected by quite a lot of different Soviet tanks that some of them were actually more advanced than this tank. And so in the next video, we'll actually see how this goes. And what's really interesting is that most of the US forces switched to M1 Abrams tank, but the Air Force, the US Air Force, actually loved using this tank for many reasons. And they still actually use it today for several tasks, specifically for any kind of explosive ordnance disposal. So if there is any explosive that needs to be taken care of, or if there's a mine somewhere, they will often use this tank and not any other vehicle, because this tank has proven itself over the years to be quite a beast. But as I mentioned before, various other countries, specifically countries that are allied with the United States, have purchased this tank and have actually used it quite a lot in their own military conflicts. And I think the most battles that this tank has seen were from the Israeli Defense Forces that would use these tanks during the Yom Kippur War against Egypt and other Arabic countries. And also, interestingly, is actually the tank that Israel respects the most. As a matter of fact, it's highly regarded in the Israeli service because of its firepower, because of its maneuverability, and because of its really thick armor. And today in Israel, the variant of this tank is known as Magach tank, and I've actually talked more about this tank in one of the previous videos. And of course, except for Israel, many other countries still use this tank today, specifically countries like Egypt, Bosnia, Spain, Greece, Turkey, Israel, Sudan, Iran, Brazil, and even Thailand still have these tanks in their service as their main battle tanks. All in all, M60 is actually a very successful tank, at least from the United States perspective, where it actually participated in a lot of battles and has won many battles by itself. And even though M60 A2 was actually kind of a fluke, even though it looked really cool and had the word space in its name, both M60 A1 and M60 A3 were actually quite respected worldwide and actually could easily oppose their equivalent from the Soviet Union. And anyway, so this is the end of the first part of this video, and in the next part we're going to recreate the battle where this tank participated and faced quite a large force that used Soviet tanks, and some of those tanks were actually overclassing this particular tank. Specifically, we're talking about T-72. And this was, of course, a conflict in Iraq during the Gulf War when one of the Marines division decided to attack an airport and decided to try to take over the airport using nothing but 200 of these tanks. And we're talking about M60 A3 models. And as you can imagine, they did pretty well, but you'll find out more about this in the next video that will be out tomorrow. Thank you so much for watching, and hopefully you enjoyed this little video about this beautiful tank and its history. And if you've enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe, like this video, and share it with your friends. And thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video. Game you later, and bye bye.